What I see is something very frightening happening with many of our younger people. Our educational establishments, and I'm saying I'm speaking on behalf of both of us, our educational establishments, through school, college and university, have been so completely hijacked by the liberal left, who actually, in the classical OED definition of it, are the most illiberal people I've ever seen or met in my life. And they have bred amongst our younger people not just to be indoctrinated to one point of view, but to think the other point of view is unacceptable, should be protested against, and even should be banned. It is horrifying. Horrifying. There are thousands of people on the streets of London tonight protesting against Donald J. Trump even visiting the United Kingdom. This young generation, who scream words like fascist, have actually themselves become the fascists.
I recently came across this article, which absolutely nails the issues regarding the crisis facing Western universities and education in general. It's titled Intersectionality and Popper's Paradox, written by Sumantra Maitra. I've included a link to the article in the notes, and I highly recommend you check it out and share it if you're concerned about these issues, as you should be. Maitra starts the article by writing that conservative rationalist Karl Popper wrote in The Open Society and Its Enemies that unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. In a society that tolerates intolerant forces, these forces will eventually take advantage of the situation and bring about the downfall of the entire society. Let's repeat that line. In a society that tolerates intolerant forces, these forces will eventually take advantage of the situation and bring about the downfall of the entire society. What a powerful and brilliant line. I can't help think of the tolerant politicians of Europe, who've opened their European doors to millions of migrants who share intolerant views towards women, gays, and Western freedoms, for example. Only time will tell if these societies fall as those intolerant forces take advantage of the situation, as they have already done so in many places. And this, as Maitra explains, is exactly what is occurring in academia. Maitra continues, nothing should be absolute and without reasonable boundaries, not even freedom. In light of this, there are three observable, identifiable ways in which this latest fad of intersectionality is taking advantage of and destroying the rational Enlightenment roots of Western academia from within. The approaches are, namely, infiltration, subversion, and coercion. Number 1. The infiltration. Maitra writes, on the face of it, infiltration at first sounds conspiratorial and even counterintuitive. There is, of course, no grand conspiracy or a cabal with a smoke-filled headquarters in the Swiss Alps led by a bald, one-eyed man stroking a cat. The roots of this recent phenomenon, however, can be traced back to Central Europe. At the height of the Cold War, Western Marxists foresaw that the opportunity for an armed socialist revolution was bleak. Gramscian Euro-communists like Marcuse and Duchka developed what is now known as the Long March through the institutions, wherein every building block of society, from professions, business, and academia to the armed forces, needed to be infiltrated by agents of change from within. Beautifully summed up by Maitra. And this is exactly what happened and what is happening as far left and Marxist policies and viewpoints have become the mainstream and appear all around us more and more often. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, most believed Marxism was dead and buried. Francis Fukuyama wrote that this was the end of history, the end of the ideological war between communism and free market capitalism. Communism had proven to be both economically and morally reprehensible, with a body count of over 100 million people in failed communist regimes across the world. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, which won the Nobel Peace Prize, revealed the horrors of the Marxist state in the Soviet Union and cut the arguments of Western Marxists to their knees. On a surface level, the average person in the West would have agreed with the notion that Marxist thought was dead and buried. Yet what occurred below the surface, behind closed doors, and whilst we in the West slept and simply enjoyed the freedoms that we take for granted, Western Marxists, led by the likes of the Frankfurt School thinkers, retreated into the departments of social sciences at universities. There they rethought their strategies for social revolution. They understood that the violent communist revolutions that took place in the streets, such as the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, would not occur in the West. This was partly the result because the class struggle model of the oppressed working class versus the oppressive middle-class bourgeois became redundant as capitalism greatly increased the standard of living of everyone involved, and in particular, the lives of the working class. The free market resulted in the emergence of a huge middle class, which thwarted the Marxist theory of class struggle. For example, since 1990 alone, 1 billion people have been lifted out of absolute poverty, particularly in China and India, as free market economics, capitalism, has been embraced. This new breed of Western Marxists therefore devised that the social revolution would take place over time, through the long march of the institutions. By indoctrinating the youth in government schools, by infiltrating the media, and ultimately getting the public to vote for a socialist leader democratically. Hence the term cultural Marxism was coined, the attempt to achieve revolution by the gradual destruction of the West, by dismantling its Judeo-Christian culture. For cultural Marxists, unlike the violent classical Marxists of the 20th century, the revolution and the destruction of the West would be a death by 1,000 cuts. One of the fathers of cultural Marxism, Antonio Gramsci, summarizes these sinister intentions. Quote, "In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture by infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media, by transforming the consciousness of society." And this is exactly what it has and is occurring. If you're skeptical about this infiltration and the long march through the institutions, have a look at these shocking facts. Since 1990, professors at universities have become progressively more and more left and liberal. In a study published looking at 40 of the leading American universities, it found that liberal professors outnumbered conservatives 11-1. Keep in mind that these figures took into account the professors from all fields, including the hard sciences, engineering, and maths. The professors in social science departments, in English departments, and in history departments are almost entirely liberal. Here's a quote from the report highlighting this bias. Quote, "If you're going to have a gender studies department, or something like that, the progressive assumptions are built into the very idea of the department. So you're not going to hire any conservative professors," said Mr. Holmes, who is the author of The Closing of the Liberal Mind. Heavily left-leaning and liberally biased universities produce liberal students who go on to work in the education system, in the media, and for the government. Hence, the long march through the institutions. This is shown in the graph, where 47% of journalists openly admit that they have liberal views, as opposed to only 18% of the American population. Hence the term coming apart, as written by Charles Murray. And this is why there is such a strong media bias against Donald Trump, for example, and conservatives in general. To return to Mitra's article, this brings us to the second premise, that of subversion. The definition of subversion is the undermining of the power and authority of an established system or institution. Mitra writes, "Subversion, as the second approach, requires interdisciplinary research to dilute the core expertise of any subject, thereby giving an equal platform and standing to unscientific, dogmatic, and ideological literature alongside established scientific methods." You see this subversion playing out in universities all across the West. For example, in the English department at Yale, Shakespeare, the greatest literary figure in our language, is no longer required reading, as A, his works may offend some students, and B, more so-called diverse authors are being optioned. Similarly, one would expect that a history student at university would learn about the core topics of Western civilization, such as the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, British history, the French Revolution, World War I, the rise of fascism, or the Russian Revolution, for example. However, the vast majority of these topics have been jettisoned, as history students now study history through the lens of identity politics with a pinch of cultural Marxism. The historian Neil Ferguson explains this with his talk titled The Decline and Fall of History.
I submit to you that a list of significant historical subjects that omitted the majority of the following 20 would be regarded as incomplete in the eyes of any reputable newspaper, magazine, textbook, or encyclopedia publisher. Number 1, any period of British history. Number 2, I'm just getting started. Number 2, the Reformation. Number 3, the Scientific Revolution. Number 4, the Enlightenment. The American Revolution. The French Revolution. The US Constitution. The Industrial Revolution. The American Civil War. German unification. World War I. The Russian Revolution. The Great Depression. The rise of fascism. The Third Reich. World War II. Decolonization. The Cold War. The history of Israel. European integration. 20. In assessing the range of courses provided by 3 major US history departments, those of Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, I have simply used this list as a benchmark. If you were an undergraduate at one of these institutions in the fall of 2016, which of these 20 subjects would you find covered by the courses on offer to you? The answer, in the case of Harvard, is not many. To be precise, a historically inclined student would look in vain for a course on all but 7 of the 20. To understand why history is an academic discipline in decline, it's worth looking at some of the courses that are available at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale this fall. Are you sitting comfortably? Take, for example, Harvard's History 1954, Emotions in History. The course description is as follows. What is the place of emotion in history? We will explore some possible analytic frames for the history of emotion and debates over the subjectivity of history, and consider their application to case studies drawn from Australian history. Now, it strikes me as not wholly surprising that this course has, according to the My Harvard site, a total enrollment of 1. Or consider the following course titles available at Yale. History 4XXJ, Indigenous Religious Histories. History 1XXJ, Witchcraft and Society in Colonial America. History 283, History of the Supernatural. History 260J, Sex, Life and Generation. All fascinating, no doubt. But as my doctoral advisor invariably asked whenever I proposed a dissertation topic, so what? Long-term effects on the elite who are educated at top American universities are, I think, unlikely to be positive. The United States of amnesia will get no better at learning from history if the people who end up running the republic know next to none at all. I believe trustees and alumni have a vitally important role to play in responding to the decline and fall of history in our universities. Let me be frank in my conclusion. I have come to doubt that the pathologies that I've described within our history departments can be cured.
Ferguson explains perfectly how history at universities has been subverted by cultural Marxists. Mitra continues to write, "The dilution of academic fields is not where it ends, however. The promotion of transgenderism as settled science, and arbitrary pronouns like them, theirs, being used in schools and universities are further examples of subversion. In every Western university, including where I research, the casual usage of made-up pronouns is being promoted by a small minority of academics and students. One risks being marked as a bigot if one chooses to question or debate such arbitrary policies. Every university has Marxist and feminist reading groups and departments that essentially control events." I'll show you a couple clips at the end of this presentation where far-left groups attempt to do exactly this and suppress the freedom of speech. This subversion that first started and is now deeply rooted in academia has crept into other social institutions, such as local governments and education departments. And now the average Joe and Sally is experiencing the effects of the long march through the institutions in mainstream culture and everyday life. For example, every second article from left-leaning media publications is about race or gender, or systematic and institutional injustice. This is because cultural Marxists have attempted to oppose groups against each other based on their identity, hence playing on identity politics. Private businesses now have to build transgender bathrooms in order to cater for the gender activists, and use gender-neutral pronouns or face paying fines of up to $250,000 or jail time. Kids in primary schools are being taught the anti-scientific premise that gender is a social construct, and that they can choose their gender like fashion and ignore biological reality. Caitlyn Jenner won Woman of the Year, and the Oscars were #OhSoWhite. Quota systems are being encouraged and enforced as the quality of outcome has become more important than the equality of opportunity and meritocracies. Diversity, tolerance, and inclusion are the highest values of any society. Mass migration and multiculturalism are only good things, and anyone who criticizes Islam is Islamophobic. Companies are hiring diversity trainers that require new employees to undertake mandatory unconscious bias training. Because even if we strive not to be racist or sexist, we probably still are. You may even be sacked if you point out the biological differences between men and women in this politically correct world. Free speech is shut down, or we essentially catch ourselves self-censoring our opinions, as anyone who has an opposing view to the politically correct line is tagged as either a bigot, racist, sexist, Nazi, white supremacist, homophobe, and so on. On and on, the shots of the ideological leftists fly across our bows. To return to Mitra's article, the third approach of the leftist long march through the institutions is that of coercion. Mitra writes, "The third approach involves coercion, or simply the tyranny of minority. A handful of students, instigated by a handful of academics, especially from intersectional disciplines and Marxist, feminist, post-colonial, and gender studies backgrounds and departments, now attempt to dictate what can or cannot be taught, discussed, or even debated at university. The cases of deplatforming and shouting down Richard Dawkins, Christina Hoff Sommers, Ben Shapiro, and Charles Murray are already evident, as are well-documented incidents at Berkeley and Mizzou. The recent threats to the Third World Quarterly for publishing something that went against the hitherto received wisdom of post-colonial literature is yet another example. Here are 3 short examples of Marxist, feminist, post-colonial gender studies students attempting to shut down free speech.
Yeah, you know, one thing I do know from what I've studied in political science and psychology is that once you start to regard yourself as a victim, you look for a perpetrator. And as soon as you look for a perpetrator, you look for someone that it's okay to hurt. It's really not a good thing.
This is a protest here. Our presence now is our protest. We come here as students against campus racism and against anti-blackness on campus. And we would like to reach out to the students of color, the humanities, as well as the sciences that we are here to support. And we want to dismantle anti-blackness and confine. We want to get some sense of solidarity.
Is in the wrong spot. All of these various things. I think this is something that we don't necessarily understand.
Black Lives Matter.
This is interesting. Let's give them a second. Has anyone disagreed with that? Has anyone disagreed with that principle? Have you ever gone someplace and had someone scream Black Lives Matter and had someone respond that that's not true?
Yes, quite a few times. Yeah.
They've said that's not true? Well, guess what? None of those. Okay, well, hold on a second. No. No one. Check this out. Check this out.
All lives matter.
Check this out.
The fact that Black Lives
Can I finish?
Yeah, like for real.
My-
I am with everyone trying to respect freedom of speech. There are some people here. This is an opportunity for us to really educate ourselves on what's going on in reality. And I'm going to let the panelists speak, but after the panelists speak, there is something that I need to say, because when we talk about identity, we need to understand that this country was formed off of creating whiteness and separating blackness. So we can't separate. No. We cannot separate our identity.
This isn't the.
This is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. Camille's going to finish his point. We're going to go down the panel. Then we're coming back out.
We're going to come back.
History. I look at the news to say my people are dying. I don't need statistics.
Do facts matter?
Sir,
Do facts matter? Do facts matter?
Let me tell you something about
All right, hey, this is how this works. If people shout, no one.
So we'll continue.
Who controls the facts? It's the system. It's the institution. Don't tell me about facts. I don't need no facts.
Okay.
Tell me that I am in a state of oppression because of the state. And I don't need no Republican or no Democrat to help me for my freedom. Because when I do with Hillary Clinton in the office, mass amounts of incarceration will happen. It is capitalism. Why our people
Okay, that's a whole nother topic. So how about this at this point? We let Camille finish his point. We go down.
Mitra's conclusion is haunting. He writes, "Of course, the silent majority of university students, professors, and taxpayers who fund these courses are not as ideologically invested as their radical colleagues. But the silent majority are also usually irrelevant, as the history of humanity illustrates. In the Soviet Union, the majority of the Russian civilians were not Stalinists, nor were most of the Chinese civilians hardcore Maoist Red Guards. Today in the West, intersectional departments are acting as commissars who are attempting to set the terms of the debate. They are increasingly framing opposition to their ideas as violence against their personhood." This reminds me of the quote, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." It's not hard to imagine these ideologically obsessed cultural Marxists in our universities shipping off those who oppose them or their groupthink to the gulags or the concentration camps of the 21st century. Mitra's closing lines are this: "Today in the West, classical education is under threat by intersectional and quasi-Marxist disciplines, such as post-colonialism and gender studies, which are trying to change the rules of debate by stifling viewpoints, hijacking disciplines, and peddling pseudoscientific gibberish. As Popper's paradox predicts, the infiltration, subversion, and coercion of Western academics is now occurring because the tolerance of liberal academia has enabled intolerance to flourish."